Boardroom Bound, episode 182, Insights into the Board and C-Suite Recruiting Process, with Lucinda Duncalfe.
We're able to provide value to companies. You don't know companies that have more diverse leadership have 20% better profitability. They're more innovative. I could go on and on with the business benefits of having diverse teams. And obviously, it's great for the individual who has that opportunity they wouldn't have before. So that's the story. I co-founded the company with True. We now have just shy of 30,000 executives 18 months later on the platform.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Lucinda Duncalfe, and she is the founder and CEO of Above Board, which is an inclusive network for executive hiring. So the C-suite and the boardroom. No cost to be a member. Opportunities are there. You get to put your hand up and say you're a fit for it. Great way to hear about board organizations and organizations you would never probably hear about otherwise. And she's going to pull back the layers on the way recruiting happens in the industry for board seats as well as the C-suite. And you're going to hear some great insights today that you can use to help yourself land the job that you're thinking about. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the Modern Board Director Candidate Packaging and Modern Board Operations knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Lucinda Duncalfe, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to join you today.
And this is a wonderful episode for me because it works on multiple levels. So what your company is doing is really disrupting this space. And it's really important for our audience to understand that and hear it and to be using what you're promoting, because it's a great tool for them to be taking advantage of. But also why you're doing it is really important when we look at what's going on in society today. So I'm excited to share that and for people to understand what that means and looks like and the drivers behind what you're doing. Now, before we get there, we do want to always talk about a bit of the history for our audience so that people can understand the person where they're coming from. And your story, of course, starts at the world's best business school where you got your MBA from Wharton. But maybe you can start us out at the beginning about how your career began, and then we'll lead into where you are today and what you're doing with Above Boards.
Sure. I'm old enough that you need a Cliff Notes version, or it would take our entire half hour to go through. Basically, I was a typical kid who graduated in the mid-'80s without really much direction, ended up just accidentally working in a tech startup, a San Francisco-based tech startup, which was not like it is now. I did go back to business school. I went to Wharton, worked in the money management industry for a few years after that, and then the internet happened, and I was dying to be on the internet, so I went back into the startup world for a little company called Infonautics that we took public in 1996. And then I went and joined an early stage company as CEO. Did that a whole number of times, joining boards, my own, of course, plus others along that way. Retired, we'll get to this story. And then most recently, I went back into that world co-founding Above Board.
And in addition to that today, you've got some board stuff, so let's call it in parallel with what you're doing, like Wire Secure, for example, right?
I do. So when I'm a sitting CEO, I generally do one for-profit board and one not-for-profit board. So my for-profit board is an early stage tech company called Wire Secure. And I guess my not-for-profit slot right now is taken by being on the board of my co-op, which I can tell you is one of the most challenging boards I've ever served on.
Politics at play, I'm sure. And this is going to come up in our show today because we're going to be talking a lot about startups or maybe venture-backed organizations and what it takes not only to land a board seat in general, but perhaps into those spaces. So give us a sense what it's like to be on a board today of that sort of organization. And when people who are listening to the show thinking, oh, that might be for me, I've never thought about it before, they can begin to conceptualize it.
Yeah, so I think it's very, very different than being on the board of a later stage company. It's it's much more hands-on. So whereas once a company is larger, there's necessarily a fair amount of time on a board is spent on governance issues. So reviewing things, ensuring that you've got an audit committee and compensation committees and all of this to ensure that everything is being done properly. On a startup board, there's much less of that. There's not so much, you can think about it strategically, there's not so much to lose and there's more to gain, right? There's more potential on the upside. So what happens as a director is you spend much more time on generative efforts. So how do you create value in a really enormous way, right? Orders of magnitudes of value. What that means is it still is noses in, hands out. You're not actually doing the work. You are probably making introductions. In my experience, that happens across the spectrum. What you're doing is really working to understand what's happening within the company and its market and to help them ideate and turn that ideation into an actionable plan. So there are always in the startup world 8,000 ways that you could move the company forward. The questions are around which are the most likely to have outsized impact. And that's a combination of what's happening in the market, where's the opportunity, and what are the capabilities of the company. So you spend much more time coaching, actual active hands-on coaching, usually one-on-one with the CEO or even with functional members of an executive team. You'll spend more time around strategy of fundraising, a lot of time actually usually around strategy of fundraising. What are the milestones we need to reach before we raise the next round? How much should that round be? Who are the right kinds of investors for the company, financial, strategic, or otherwise? So it's more roll up your sleeves, hands on. It's more, I think, green, sort of blue skying than it is at later stages, and much less on reporting and checking and ensuring that everything is buttoned up.
Now, I love the way you frame this here, that there's three parts of board work, of the governance, the strategy, and the generative. When most people tend to think of a board, generally we're probably thinking a public company. Maybe people go to the largest public companies, right, like a JP Morgan of the world. And there, people probably think, oh, governance and strategy. And probably similar to what you've said, we spend too much time on governance, not enough on strategy. Really helpful people in the audience thinking, where are my skills best lying in helping organization? If the generative stuff is where you really feel you add the most value, then we've just heard from Lucinda why you should be looking at a space that perhaps most people don't think about generally in terms of the early stage companies. Now, Lucinda, I want to make sure we pivot here a little bit because in some ways this is a direct fit to the organization, what you're doing with Above Boards today about helping people to get onto boards in a very different way than they've done before. But let me allow you to tell this story. How did this organization come about? Because it's really fascinating about how you've turned the industry on its head.
Well, thank you. So it was like almost everything in my career, a really fruitful combination of accidents. So I was running a relatively large private SaaS company, software as a service company, and for personal reasons, I had decided to retire. I was certainly still had lots of energy, but I share publicly that I have a daughter who was very sick with Lyme disease and had been for years, and had just gotten really the only time in my career I ever got to the point where I felt like I was neither being a great CEO or a great mom. And when push comes to shove with those two roles, mom wins. And so I retired, and the board of that company hired a search firm called True Search. Some folks in your audience may not have heard about them. They just announced a couple weeks ago, they're now the 6th largest search firm in the U.S. That puts them right behind the ones that are known as the Shreks, the five largest. It's Spencer Stewart, Heidrick and Struggles, Russell Reynolds, Egon Zehnder, and Korn Ferry. Very, very fast growing, focused on the search on the growth ecosystem. So on startups, venture capital firms, private equity firms, growth equity backed companies, digital and tech within large companies, and large tech. So very fast growing firm focused on our specific type of company. We hired them. They helped. I had been placed by them at this company. I'd used them to hire some of my execs, and then we hired them to replace me. We ended up just after that selling the company to the private equity. I happily was on the record as intending to retire, so I rode off into what I thought was going to be a pretty classic third stage of a career for somebody like me. That is serving on boards and advisory and maybe doing some angel investing and that sort of thing. They reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you come help us with some of our technology?" And I love the guys. The reason that they've been able to grow the way they have is that they have made really significant investments in innovation and tech. And so I started working with them. And they helped me see the following thing about how retained search works. And this is important to your listeners also who'd like to get on a board, because those biggest public company boards are all done through this process. They do the same thing we all do when we're looking for people, is you sit there and you say, who do we know? Right? And hopefully you don't ever go to search. You know somebody, you fill it, low risk, fast, free. If that doesn't work, you go to retained executive search. Retained search is full service. There's no partial. It's full service. It's expensive. And there's nothing in between those two. You see that gap and you think, well, why isn't there something that's more cost effective? Why isn't there something where I can have some service, not full service? Why isn't there something tech enabled? And they had identified that hole in the market. I was doing some work with them around that. And then I realized that industry structure is responsible for the perpetuation of the lack of diversity at the board and executive level. Because the reality is those rooms today are not diverse. The folks in the room, it's relatively homogenous, and we're humans. And I've now done the anthropological research, sociological research to tell you that we do, in fact, know people who look like us. So if both these approaches are leveraging existing networks, folks who have been underrepresented, women, people of color, et cetera, we're not going to get those jobs. We don't have access to those positions. And so I realized those two things come together, and there was this enormous opportunity to provide a new way for companies to bring senior people into the fold, and for those senior people to see those opportunities. And that led to the founding of Above Board. So we are an inclusive yet exclusive platform. We're a community where executives, VP level and above, of any demographic, but we focus on outreach to those who are underrepresented, can come in and see our 600 plus opportunities and actively put themselves in. And those opportunities are not the kind that are on LinkedIn or Indeed. Right, they're exclusive to us. 90% plus of them are only on our platform because they're very senior. They're executive, C-suite, senior executive. And so by opening up the access in that way, we're able to provide value to companies. If you don't know, companies that have more diverse leadership have 20% better profitability. They're more innovative. I could go on and on with the business benefits of having diverse teams. And obviously, it's great for the individual who has that opportunity they wouldn't have before. So that's the story. I co-founded the company with True. We now have just shy of 30,000 executives 18 months later on the platform. So it's working.
And let's be clear, the price point is pretty low, right?
It's free for individual members. That's right. We're paid by the client in the same way a search firm might be paid by the client.
And so I imagine there's some people in the audience going, okay, this is a fascinating change of technology. And we can all agree having diversity in the boardroom is important to have diversity of thought, right? We need that around the table.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense. Pale, male, and stale should not be the opportunity set for any board these days. It doesn't work.
You said it, not me.
it's not what we're going for, right? For a variety of reasons. And, we can also talk about some of what's gone on in the country over the last few years, like George Floyd and other things. We realize this is just an opportunity at scale to be doing this now, to connecting in the right people. But I'm sure there's some people in the audience that are going, well, I imagine one of the reasons they might have used the Shrek firms in the past is that they didn't want it publicly posted. Like a public company doesn't want to say an advertisement out there that we're looking for this new board member because whatever, so-and-so seat is being vacated for retirement or whatever it might be. So I imagine that might be a hesitation for some organizations. So the CEOs or board members of some people listening to the show, how would you speak to that concern that they might have about how Above Board could address that?
That's exactly right. I think what we see in real life, and we have very large corporate clients already, we have about 30 of them, is twofold. First of all, more companies than you might think are willing to do it publicly. I think because when they do, it is also saying to the world that diversity is important to them. And so there's marketing value, employer marketing value in being associated with Above Board. So I will share with you, well, let me get to the second way. The second thing is that we do list opportunities confidentially if the client requires it. So it'll say something like, large CPG company is looking for a CMO and the requirements for that without having the location or the name of the company. So we absolutely do have listings that are confidential. I'll share with you, to my great surprise, when I did the original planning, we thought that 40% of our listings would be confidential. In fact, it's less than 5%, proving the point that companies are actually much more open about this than one would have thought.
Well, I suppose in many ways the world has moved on to realize those who are promoting and championing diversity, it's seen as a positive for not only for people that you're trying to hire, but perhaps the employees you have today and keeping them engaged. That's fascinating.
And the customers and consumers, they want
Right.
to know that too. Yeah, what
Shareholders,
we hear a lot of is people are looking now to see rubber meets the road. It's all well and good that you did a sponsorship of XYZ or you did a Super Bowl ad or whatever it is. Show me that you're actually hiring people. And that's where we hit, is we actually help them hire people.
Which is great. And I imagine there's more to this story behind this that we could share about, why it's time to assess candidates based on competencies rather than backgrounds. And I'm sure that is part of the conversation you have with some organizations as they consider moving from Shrek to what you're doing.
Absolutely. Competencies, we believe, is the key to unlocking the rest of the pipeline. So if we can help to connect people at the top of the employment pipeline, that's awesome. How do we ensure that the right people are then hired? We believe the magic key, and this is not unique idea of Above Boards. I think we're unique in terms of our implementation of it, but it's not our idea, is to focus on competencies. So less on a checkbox, I was here, I did this, because the truth is you could have been, you had a relatively senior position at Facebook, that's great, but you might have been terrible at it. The question is, what competencies do you have? How have you evidenced those competencies? And that levels the playing field, because you can get a competency in all different forums, right? It doesn't have to have been at Facebook. And so that pivot enables the progression of people through the hiring pipeline.
And I guess related to that, there might be a different answer to this for, say, the C-suite versus the boardroom, right? Because there's two parts of this. It was just fascinating to me. It seems like the boardroom is diversifying faster. We can see that in the annual photo of companies, right? So not just gender, but socioeconomic background, all sorts of different ways. And it seems like that's a weird thing that's going faster than the C-suite. So I'm glad it's going well. I'd like to see the C-suite also propel at the same sort of rate. You're bringing a lot of candidates forward in this way. And it's really interesting to think about, there's this dichotomy in the boardroom of how to get the job, that experience, how do you get experience without a job? You ideally want someone to hire who's been in the boardroom before you put them there, but everybody's got to have their first job somewhere. Whereas it seems like in the C-suite, they're more open to someone, to your point. You've got the right competencies. We think you'll be successful here. We'll put you in there. And it's sort of like, well, how do those two things go with each other? Because they're both important.
Yeah, and there's a very funny dynamic. I think you're right that in fact the numbers are moving faster at the board level than at the C-suite level. The other thing we see, I'll share one statistic that comes from McKinsey that I think is amazing. So let's just think about Black executives, male and female. In the workforce at large, 12% of folks are Black. At the executive level, it's only 5%, right? So 2.5 times to get to population. But then let's look at the boards. What's your guess on what the percentage is at the board level? 11.
I would think, I was going to say double, yeah.
Double, right? So what's happening there? How is that even possible? What's happening is, whereas you can only have one full-time job, you could have multiple board seats.
Yeah.
So what's happening is you've got a couple of the most, experienced people. I intentionally didn't use the word qualified, but rather experienced people who are taking multiple seats. Now that's great, but it needs to trickle down through, right? Yeah. And so this shift in terms of thinking about people based on their competencies, that's what's going to enable that shift to pull in at the executive level. If we have the folks early on, how do we draw them through? Part of how we draw them through will be to drive from the board backwards.
Which makes sense. Once you have one incredible board member on there, even if they're on 5 different boards, they are opening the doors for other people to follow. So in some ways, it's a positive, even if it's not exactly what you want. You'd prefer 5 people. That one person has a multiplier effect, maybe many times above themselves. Now, I'm sure Lucinda, a bunch of people going, wow, this sounds great for me. Once I stop driving and stop listening to this episode, I'm going to go sign up. Let's give them a sense what it looks and feels like. And I've done a road test myself, and it seems so almost just dead easy, right? You're just building out your profile, which we already said was a really good low price point. You're building out your profile, and you're setting up your job searches. And when you find one you like, you basically say, hey, I'm interested, and it puts you into the black box funnel with all the other candidates. And if they're interested, they come back to you. Is that about right?
That's perfect. I don't need to add a word.
So technology is our friend, and it really works well. And it's just fascinating to think about. We can go back to maybe when Monster was ruling the space of job board. It's not anything like this in that experience, and it's sort of a self-diagnosing community of I am someone who's qualified, and an organization gets all those candidates. Do you think organizations are using your service in addition to clearly their own networks and other people to filter?
Absolutely.
Is the goal that eventually that all they need to do is come to you? What's the grand vision as we go forward?
A couple of key points about what happens after somebody gets into a search that I think folks in general just don't know. So first of all, the average executive search or board search includes 300 candidates and takes 140 days on average. That's not us at Above Board, that's the market in general. So, you come and you put yourself in the search at Above Board. What happens then is that the recruiter sees you, right? You say, hey, here I am, and your presence is completely confidential until you do that. So you can join and just poke around and no one knows you're there. Once you say, hey, I'm interested, just that recruiter can see you. They then decide, am I one of the 300 or not? If they say yes, it still is likely to take you 140 days. So I think people are often surprised about how intense the process is and how long it takes. These are big decisions companies are making. It does not look anything like it looks at the staffing level. The other thing, even more foundationally, that we find lots of people don't understand is that the process at this level, at the VP level, flipped from being an inbound process to an outbound process. So at the lower levels, you see an ad, you put yourself in, an ATS system does some AI and decides whether to pass you along, and the hiring manager is looking at dozens of people like you saying yes, no, yes, no. Once you hit the VP level all the way up through the board, it reverses, and what's generally happening is search firms are hired, or your friends are reaching out to you. Right? So as a person who's interested in a board, mostly you just have to sit there and wait for someone to reach out to you, which, is great if you're connected in the existing networks. It's not so great if you're one of the most of us who are not. So what we're doing is I describe us as the Bumble of executive search. We reverse the process. So we make the more senior stuff look like the more junior stuff, which is fairer. Right? It's opening up access. It creates a level playing field for people.
Sure.
So that's, I think, some really important background about how this works, just in general, not just at Above Board.
And that fits with a lot of what we talk about on this show is there's, key documents you need to have ready if you wanted to be on a board, your board bio, your board resume and your LinkedIn profile, etc. But you also have to put your hand up and tell people so that they would think of you and use their networks for you. And so in some ways you've made it really easy for someone to put their hand up and go wave it over. I'm over here. I'm really interested and I could be a really good fit for some of these, which is great. But give us a little bit of insight. You talked about, say 300, probably all for the most part, good on spec compared to maybe the job description once things have been needled out. Help people get a sense for where they should spend their time on, say, their LinkedIn profile or their resume. How do they make themselves stand out for that board seat that they've seen on your site and they go, this is perfect for me?
Yeah, so what we see really consistently is the biggest missing piece is the positioning. So people aren't clear enough about this is the value that I bring. This is the kind of board I can deliver that value to, and then being ruthless about sticking to that. So folks who've had amazing careers in whatever their specific function and industry are, then get to the board level, and all of a sudden I'm talking to them, and they basically think that they're going to add innovation, and they're going to do that at any size company in any industry. Well, no, you're not. And so the reality is, if you're good for everybody, you're good for nobody. So I think the really critical piece is, what is it that's your value add and interest, and why? And then articulate that through, as you described, your LinkedIn, your board bio, your board resume. So LinkedIn's a great example. If you go look at some really senior board members, look at what their LinkedIns look like. They're usually very stripped down. I mean, mine actually right now fails this test completely. If you want to look at one that is not how it should look, but I'm not trying to get on any board. It should be streamlined. Every point there focused on this positioning that you have for yourself. In all your interviews, if you make it that far, you should be doubling down on what are those value adds you bring, what's the proof point of those value adds. Within the Above Board platform, we just launched a new feature that allows you to send a message to the recruiter. So before this, you just sent your resume, your LinkedIn profile and our profile, and said, hey, this is me. What you really want to do now is say you optimize your LinkedIn, you then optimize your program, your profile on Above Board, which mirrors LinkedIn, and then you add a brief note that specifies that value you bring, so that now you have a consistent link through everything that they see about you. If they're going to I guarantee you they're going to do backdoor references. So you need to make sure that positioning is genuine, and that when folks who they reach out to find out about you, to check on you, ask questions, they're going to get answers that are consistent with that. So you're better off with a smaller target, very tight honing, and consistent through every touch point than trying to chase every rabbit.
That makes a lot of sense, and I can see what you're saying. And in some ways, if I translate it for the audience, it's almost like you want to be the clear subject matter expert on whatever your topic is. That ideally, you'd be on public speaking platforms, or you have a book, you're quoted in the press, whatever it might be, and that has to come through in all your materials to stand out. And even if you haven't had a chance to do that publicly, that you are still known for that, your references are going to know you for that, and that messaging is very obvious. I agree with you. No one wants someone who's a jack of all trades on their board. But Lucinda, if I sort of take that and think about this a slightly different, we've had Russ Reynolds on the show before, and I remember asking about it. So you basically launched this search industry, right? How do you think about this? How should, people probably want to reach out to you after this to be in touch with you. What would you think about it? He goes, I don't need anybody to reach out to me. I know the people that I will need to go and find to reach out to for the opportunities that we have. And I thought, I get that. I understand it from a very networked person. And what you've got here with your organization Above Board is almost the opposite of someone saying, as we said in the show, I don't have that network today. No one's going to know to find me per se, but I have all the qualifications. I would be the right person for this. I'm going to put my hand up. So I love that you've opened the door to that. But I'd love your thoughts on this opportunity discussion that we're having about how someone should or should not be doing outreach.
So they should absolutely be doing what you said earlier, which is just tell everybody you know who might have contact with someone where there's going to be a board search. that you're interested in doing that, and your one sentence why and what you offer. I really smiled and laughed as you described that interview, because of course he thinks that. He thinks he knows everybody in the world. So I guarantee you 98.9% of your listeners have no connection to Russ Reynolds. How does he think he knows everybody? I'm like, I'll share a very, what to me, maybe, I don't know whether this will translate, funny anecdote. When I was deciding to do this and doing some of the initial research, I was at a Hunt Scanlon event. They're the kind of industry rag in the executive recruiting world. I was at one of their events, which was held at the Harvard Club in New York, and it was a diversity event. And there's 500 people in the room or something. I'm looking around, and there might be 10 people of color in the entire audience. And there's probably 40% women, but the average age of the women is 23, and the average age of the men is 54. And in the room, if anybody's been there in the main conference area at the Harvard Club, there's this enormous stuffed elephant head. Yeah, and I just thought this is just too on the nose. It's the elephant in the room, and it's dead. So I am all about this disruption, both because I think that it's an enormous business opportunity for above board, but as much because of that exact thinking, that he knows everybody in the world. No, he doesn't.
Well, Lucinda, I love what you're doing with the organization. I want to try to wrap this up today with some advice and guidance. So people listening to the show either say are on their first board and now they want a portfolio, or they're close to landing their first board or trying to land that seat. And I'd love to tap into a little bit of your experience as sort of a leave behind story. So when people think about, how do I be successful in a boardroom? I know you found it a surprise when you got there, thinking about sort of the dynamic and what it was going to be like. And it wasn't quite what you expected. And I'm sure you'd have guidance for people as they prepare to be in that seat. They've worked so hard to get it, and how they be successful. Tell us what the experience was for you and why it was surprising.
Yeah, I will share. It's funny to me looking back, and I'll admit I've even had this experience multiple times as I went to different scales of boards or prestige of a board. I thought it was going to be a big deal. I thought it would be formal. I thought there'd be lots of, careful reporting, and I'd have to do so much preparation, and that it would be like a drilling. And in fact, you show up, and it's just like any of your teams at work. It's amazing. It's probably even more collegial. No competitiveness. I mean, sometimes you'll get, especially in private company boards with venture capitalists, you'll have somebody who's kind of maybe taking more than their share of airtime. But overall, boards go to dinner together. They get to know each other. They talk in between. It's extremely casual, right? Business casual, but it's extremely casual. And I think, I've always been made to feel at home on every board I've been on, although generally I've been the only woman. Nonetheless, I've felt very comfortable. And so I think what others can know is, yes, it is a big responsibility, and you do have to prepare. You have to spend the time really deeply thinking about the business and working hard to add value. But it's not stressful at all in the way I thought it would be. It's actually some of the most fun I've had at work through the years is in boards, where there's a really great working relationship with the management team. And you can add value in this way that's really unique after you've built up your expertise over all these years. So that's my biggest lesson, is it's actually much more relaxed than you'd think.
All right, so encouraging words on your journey to wanting to land that board seat. And today we described a great opportunity to help you on that journey. And Lucinda, we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you for the opportunity. I am so excited about the potential for folks who are listening to join Above Board, and hopefully there's a couple out there who would like to list board openings with us as well. So thanks for the opportunity. I love talking about this stuff.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Lucinda Duncalfe and a great organization Above Board that's so relevant for all of us. No cost to be a participant, to see opportunities out there, to put yourself forward, Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links, including to their website. Now be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to Boardroom Bound.